Here we have Abraham, the father of the faithful. In fact, he is the father of all three Abrahamic religions, being Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. But out of the three, Christianity is the only one that doesn't think works are part of our faith, but rather, salvation is by faith alone. And I'll use Abraham as an example of this. For example, Galatians 3:6, Romans 4:1-3 say Abraham believed God and it was accounted to him for righteousness. But this is a huge contradiction of what James taught, or is it? In James 2, James asks the question, if a man has faith but not works, can faith save him? And apparently James doesn't seem to think so. In verse 17 he says, faith, if it does not have works, is dead. James says, show me your faith without works and I'll show you my faith by my works. James says, big deal if you believe, even the devils believe. And again, faith without works is dead. Verse 21, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son upon the altar? So you see how faith brings works, and by works faith is made perfect. And here's that famous verse, Abraham believed God and it was imputed to him for righteousness, and he was called a friend of God, meaning he walked with God in obedience. Verse 24, he says, a man is justified by works and not by faith only. And again for the third time he says, faith without works is dead. So we can clearly see James says belief and faith are two different things. So what's the definition of belief? Well, belief comes from the Greek word pisteuo, which means to have faith, trust, especially one's spiritual well-being, to Christ. Well, what about faith? It comes from a very similar Greek word, pistis, and it means persuasion, moral conviction, especially reliance on Christ for salvation, and by extension, the system of religion, or his gospel, or what he taught. But pistis comes from pitho, an even deeper meaning, to assent, to evidence or authority, to obey, to trust and yield. So this is true biblical faith. It starts with belief or faith alone, pisteuo, then comes pistis, or moral conviction, not only relying on Christ for salvation, but believing in his teachings, or his gospel. Then comes pitho, where you go from faith alone, getting moral conviction, and believing everything Christ taught, then agreeing with everything Christ taught, and obeying, trusting, and yielding to his authority. That is true biblical faith. Works. But sadly, most just want to pisteuo, or just believe faith alone. They don't want to have to do the works, obey, yield to his authority. And this was the faith of Abraham. He was faithful. Faithful to God, God's way, the way. The fact is, faith and obedience go hand in hand. And we see a great example of this in Hebrews 3. And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but those who did not obey? So we can see they were unable to enter in because of unbelief. So again, true biblical faith is obedience. And this was the faith of Abraham. By faith, Abraham obeyed and left his fortune, and by faith, Abraham stayed in the promised land in tents because of belief in the promise. In fact, he believed the promise so much that he offered up his only son Isaac, believing that God would raise him up even from the dead. Well, now that's faith. But Abraham was also faithful, so faithful that he had a covenant made between him and God. In Genesis 17, I am the Almighty God, walk before me and be perfect, and I will make a covenant between me and thee, and I will multiply thee exceedingly. And what was Abraham faithful to? Well, he was faithful to God and his way, the only way. For I have chosen him, that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord, by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he had promised him. So God knows that Abraham will be faithful to his end of a covenant, which was to be obedient to the Torah. So there you have it. Abraham didn't just believe, he had faith. He was faithful. He was faithful to God and his laws. He was faithful to God and his ways, the way.